With the rumors of a second remake on the horizon, there isn't a better time to go back to the very game that started the entire Resident Evil franchise and see how it holds up in the present day, and when put in contrast to its remake, because to be honest, I think there is a stronger debate here than one would normally imagine. Yes, this is going to be one of those cozy videos, so sit back, grab your popcorn, relax, and let us begin. The gameplay in both games is very similar, although the remake enhances the experience by adding more types of enemies, environments, and even weapons. It also adds several quality of life improvements like a button that turns your character around, and a button to swap from targets while aiming. Overall, even if the original game is the oldest and roughest version of this gameplay style, the core foundation that spawned an entire franchise with numerous games made in this particular style is still here, and truth be told, I was seriously surprised at how fun this game is. There are several other franchises that required of a second or at times even a third game to reach its full potential, mechanically, critically, and monetarily. Great example, Far Cry and Sniper Elite, but not this one. This is Resident Evil in all of its potential. I didn't play this game back in the day, so I don't know how it felt playing it in the PS1 and with the controllers of the time, but at least this GOG version is very well optimized, functional with modern controllers, and very responsive. When compared to other games of the time, this game feels smooth in one's hands. Believe it or not, Sniper Elite 1 from 2005 is junkier than Resident Evil 1 9 years before. When I played the remake, I did so using the modernized controls, because I couldn't get used to the tank controls. The reality is that I could play that game because of the modernized controls. Otherwise, I wouldn't be making these videos nowadays. The original game, obviously, doesn't have modernized controls, so I had to stick to the tank controls. However, due to how smooth the controls feel in this GOG release, then the transition to the tank controls wasn't as hard as I was expecting at first. Now, both systems come with their caveats. The modernized controls, obviously, offer the advantage of moving around with more speed and agility. They make it easier to escape enemies grasping at you. However, the tank controls to this day have some fundamental advantages that could possibly make it harder for me to go back to the modernized controls, and that is precision. By precision I mean the reliability of always moving in the direction that I want. A problem that I always encountered with the modernized controls in both RE1 Remake and RE0 is that inputs change depending on the angle of a camera. That means that if you're going forward and the camera shifts angles, then forward becomes backward, or left or right, depending on the angle of the camera, and that constant change of inputs can confuse you and accidentally launch you straight into the arms of an enemy. With the tank controls, however, you always have the security that forward is forward, backwards is backwards, left is left, and right is right, regardless of where the camera is at the time. Tank controlling is slower and makes it harder to escape from gritty situations, and RE1 could certainly benefit in having a 180-degree spin button like future games will have, but tank controls are better in many ways than the modernized controls. So once you get the hang of RE gameplay with a modernized system, it could well be a good idea to try the tank controls, because you might find more benefit to them than you believe. In any case, that is the only way you can play the classic trilogy, and RE1 is the best place to start learning. Obviously, both versions of the game have their differences in both controls and gameplay, that make one or the other easier and harder depending on the situation. One of the biggest differences that I encountered when playing these games is the differences between Jill and Chris's campaigns in each game, particularly when it comes to difficulty. In the original Resident Evil, Jill's campaign is treated almost like an easy mode, while Chris is a secret hard mode. The biggest difference between the two characters is that Jill can save the game at any time she visits a typewriter, while Chris is subjected to ink ribbons. The difference that makes in both campaigns is night and day. That's without saying that Jill has more space to carry items and is able to gather the shotgun way sooner than Chris, because Barry saves her from the death trap. Jill also has a picklock right from the start, which allows her to open locked doors and desks with supplies sooner than Chris, who is limited to finding specific keys. In the remake, the developers closed the gap of difficulty between the two characters. In simple words, Jill's campaign is tougher in the remake and Chris's is considerably easier. Even if they still have the same difference in the inventory space, now Chris gets to have his own starting item, the lighter, what makes sense because it was always part of the character from the very beginning, so I don't know why he didn't have one in the original game. And this one allows him to solve lighter-based puzzles quicker than Jill, who has to find a lighter throughout the house first. The lighter also helps Chris burn zombies down without sacrificing inventory space, yet again an advantage that Jill lacks. Jill in the remake is also subjected to ink ribbons, stripping her of the most important thing that made her campaign so easy in the original game. And Rebecca, in Chris's campaign, is even more helpful than she was in the original game, because now she can heal Chris's wounds as soon as he meets her, and not later, in the guardhouse, as was in the original. This slight difference makes Chris's early hours in the remake significantly easier than they are in the original game. The combat is basically the same, although each game has slight differences that can make it easier or harder depending on which game you played first and your level of experience with this type of game. One thing that makes the original RE easier, at least for me, is the lack of crimson heads, thus meaning that once you defeat a zombie and the pool of blood erupts, it is dead. This eliminates the concern of having to carry the lightened kerosene as you explore the mansion. In fact, there is no kerosene whatsoever in this original game because it isn't necessary. The shotgun is also way more powerful and reliable in the original game than in the remake, due to the fact that it is a certified one-shot kill for all zombies if you aim at the head, while in the remake they made it more randomized in order to maintain an ever-present level of dread. Yes, shotguns are still very powerful in the remake, but once in a while, a shot might not hit the right spot, and now you have a very hungry zombie too close for you to run. However, not everything in the original game is easier. Great example, the hunters. Now, those were the true pain in the asses for me when playing this original title. In the remake, these enemies could certainly pack a punch, and I remember dying to them a few times. However, it is easy to stun lock them. With the Magnum gun you can even one-shot them, and their attack patterns are always predictable. Fighting them isn't that hard if you have enough space and ammo. Avoiding them is also surprisingly easy if you time it right. However, in the original game, these hunters were very fast, and although you can still one-shot them with the Magnum, it is harder because their attack patterns are harder to predict. Sometimes they growl before launching at you, and other times they will simply fly around in no particular order, scratching you with their vicious claws and at times even running away with your head. Yes, exactly what you heard. The original game is gorier than the remake, imagine that? And although the game doesn't get anywhere near as gory as other titles of its time, it certainly had that colorful 90s video game gore, one that was slightly lost through the transition of the new millennia. In any case, there were a few times I wish I could have had a defense weapon to protect myself from a hunter hog or a dog bite, but I didn't. Defense weapons was a brilliant idea that came several games later and not in the first game. The boss fights is something that was significantly improved in the remake. They are more spectacular and frightening in their presentation and at times harder. The biggest challenge in the original game came mainly because of the tank controls. Otherwise, the fights were straightforward enough. However, even if they play pretty similar in the remake adds a few more details that make fighting these characters more complicated, like confusing maze-like arenas and companions that can get killed and ruin their perfect ending. The Tyrant boss fight is the best example to this. In the original game, you fight this beast alone, but in the remake, you have either Barry or Becca and each one of them can get killed. If you've seen my RE0 video, then you know what a torment it was getting Rebecca out of that fight alive. The puzzles were a highlight for me in both games. Both are well implemented and designed. Aside of adding more rooms and types of keys to make the mansion all the more confusing, the remake also added more puzzles inside those rooms to conceal those added keys. Quoting Detective Blanc's eloquence, RE1 Remake can feel like a donut within a donut. One puzzle unveils the next, almost like a baby brother version of a missed game, and less straightforward as was the original Resident Evil, whose puzzles usually led to opening a door or unveiling a key and just that. Aside of adding new stuff to the game, the remake also altered the puzzles retained from the original. Puzzles like the one in the painting room with the crows and the one blocking you from the laboratory in the guardhouse are two great examples, and solving each one of them felt great. The best thing about both games is that both surprised me and made me solve new challenges. One doesn't invalidate the other, both coexist perfectly. The presentation in both games is spectacular. I almost envy those that experienced these games back in the days. Both games have slightly different aesthetics, and both are effective in their respective ways. This was a time in which video game graphics weren't able to create dynamic shadows, and thus they had to rely on coloring to create a sense of brooding darkness, and OG Resident Evil was great at doing that. The graphics in the older game are obviously dated, yes, even more so considering how beautiful and timeless the graphics in the remake and RE0 are. However, I don't think that should be much of a problem for younger players. If indie games have taught us something in recent years, then it is that graphics were never the problem with older games, just lunar logic and janky controls. So if you have played modern indie games, and particularly those that use retro art style, jumping into these older games shouldn't be that much of a hazard. The music, however, is something that the remake improved upon by a mile. The original game had some great music tracks and some that I could say I like perhaps even more than the remake counterparts, like the save room theme, although that could change tomorrow depending on the mood. That's how great both are. But other tracks, like the one used in tense scenarios, can actually feel dissonant, and part of what adds to the overall cheesiness of this original game.
Barry?
What is it?
Watch out! It's a monster!
Let me take care of this. What is it?
Another problem with the sound of this game is that the music is at times too loud, making it hard to understand what the characters are saying. This wouldn't be that much of a problem if you were able to lower the sound in the settings, but you can't. There are also no subtitles, which is also bad. The remake, on the other hand, has a perfect score that fits all situations perfectly. The music can be lowered in the settings, and in any case, there are subtitles, which is always a plus. This is without talking about the acting per se and how it affects the impact of the story. This leads me neatly to the next section of the video. The story is mostly the same, although the remake expanded upon it, adding new scenes and new characters altogether. Most of these things are better in the remake than in the original, but others in my opinion aren't, like the sequence in which you witness the first zombie of the game. This sequence, at least for me, was more impactful in the original game than in the remake because it is clearer what happens. I admit that I didn't understand this scene well when I played the remake the first time, thinking that yes, the zombie is just eating its victim, but it was in the original version that I fully understood the extent of the scene's gruesomeness. The zombie is not just eating its victim, it is beating the neck so fiercely that it ripped the head apart. The clear and shamelessly visceral nature of the original game's photography actually helps in this scene, more than the darker and moodier tones of the remake. Also, the fact that the zombie in the original game had human eyes that very distinctly look at you makes the creature even more terrifying than in the remake. However, the same cannot be said for the characters.
Oh, Barry!
Many of you know how iconic this game is for its cheesy writing and bad acting. Every single character in this game is louder and cornier than in the remake, to a point that they make the already hilarious characters of the remake seem deadly serious by comparison. Even so, I found in the characters the same attributes that endear me to them in the remake. Julia Voth's Jill is obviously more detailed than the polygonal shapes of classic Jill, so obviously she looks better. Remake Jill is also more grounded and visceral in her depiction of pain and effort, better reflecting the horror vibes of the game, and although classic Jill is more over the top in her delivery and walks around with the illimitable cool of a 90s adventure game protagonist, seemingly oblivious to the horrors around her, all of these dissonant elements come together to create a peculiar personality that is charming by itself. And when all is said and done, classic Jill also excels in the areas that I lauded from remake Jill in my very first Resident Evil video, and those are the same gentleness and intelligence that belies her toughness, and her ability to be grateful when her friends help her. All of these characteristics that are lacking in the way present-day heroines are written. The same can be said for Chris Redfield. In this version of the character, I found the same heroic nature, big brotherly gentleness, and overall macho man personality of the remake, only several notches higher in cheesiness. However, when it comes to Barry and Becca, I like the remake versions more for a few reasons. Classic Rebecca is so loud and corny that she makes remake Rebecca seem edgy by comparison. Remake Rebecca is a great example to how a character improves dramatically with a few fixes in the writing and by slightly lowering the latitudes of the human voice. Aside of that, remake Rebecca plays exactly the same role as her classic counterpart, although these few tweaks and fixes make a night and day difference. Classic Barry will always have the advantage over remake Barry when it comes to the Jill sandwich meme. But aside of that, I prefer the more subtle and heroically tormented approach of remake Barry, and his character is all the more fleshed out in the remake as well. But when all is said and done, both Rebecca and Barry serve almost like the secret weapon of Resident Evil 1 in its two versions. They are surprisingly helpful in both games, and they make the experience all the more memorable. When I look back at this game in any of its versions, I usually remember Jill with Barry or Chris with Rebecca before anything else.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
O.G. Wesker is one of the funniest cases in this original game, and one of the best examples of the cheesiness of this game's writing and acting. O.G. Wesker is at this point iconic for these reasons, and one of the characters that saw the most improvement in the remake. O.G. Wesker is, like everyone else in the game, louder and very literal in his choosing of words. He is also more petulant, cartoonishly arrogant, and is constantly trying to convince people that he is his own boss and not Umbrella's lapdog. Remake Wesker is more subtle in both acting and writing, and he better portrays more the idea of being an agent of Umbrella while at the same time planning to go rogue. The confrontation with both Jill and Chris is considerably better in the remake than in the original, mainly because in the original, Wesker only talks, patting himself on the back all along, and at times almost contradicting himself. Remake Wesker, on the other hand, is less laughable and quietly induces a sense of tension in all of his scenes. Unlike the original, who just talks, this one actually attacks Chris and Jill, imposing his dominance in each scene, whether through quiet composed presence or sheer brutality. I also like that in the remake he is the one to release the tyrant through sheer villainy and not Barry by accident. The climax is overall better in the remake than in the original, very similar in idea, gameplay and resolution, but improved in every aspect of its delivery.
Resident Evil.
Playing Resident Evil 1 in its original version was a similar experience to playing Quest for Glory 1 Remake and then going back to the original game. Of course, the remake is better graphics, more polished gameplay, and easier and more intuitive user interface, but there were some things about the older game that were actually better. Monsters in the original Quest for Glory were even scarier than in the remake, due to the angle of the camera, although this, by consequence, made fighting them needlessly hard, to why the remake adopted the same over-the-shoulder style of the second and third game. But even more than the combat itself, because it definitely needed improvement, the area in which the original Quest for Glory shined was more in the way it delivered its story. The best example is the ending. OG Quest for Glory had a fully animated ending, with bombastic music, lightning and thunder, fully animated credits that had a spectacular worldview of the Valley of Spielberg, with the hero and friends flying around on their magic carpet, scored with the enchanting music of Erana's Peace, a melody that slowly changes into the Arabic moods that hints the hero's next adventure, trial by fire in the land of Shapir. However, the remake had the most hurried, bland, silent and anticlimactic ending possible. No music, no lightning and thunders, the credits were the same ones from the opening credits, no hints to the second game, and although this picture of the proud hero is the standout of this ending, the lack of music makes the original version superior without much difficulty. The remake's ending is so dull that it could only be rivaled by the fifth and final game, which also had the most hurried and uninspired ending this beautiful franchise didn't deserve.
These are the heroes of Silmaria.
Quest for Glory 5, you broke my heart. All of this tangent is to say that the original Resident Evil 1 holds up surprisingly well even when put in contrast to its remake. Yes, Resident Evil 1 Remake is the definitive way of playing this game. The story is more developed, the characters better written and acted, and the game has way more content and replay value without becoming overloaded. That being said, the original game stands the test of time surprisingly well, and better than I was expecting. You will encounter the same familiar enjoyment of the remake along with a lot of its own unique charm, and some sequences are actually better here. Case in point, the computer puzzle. The remake gave us this full screen without personality, while in the original game we had this beautiful dated load screen with the sound of those classic keyboards typing you into deep relaxation and, of course, both Jill and Chris's charisma flowing through the whole sequence, not just when things go wrong with the passwords.
Damn.
But when things go right. Overall, this is a great game that I'm happy to have played, and I definitely give it my blue thumbs up. If you like classic RE games and for some reason haven't dived into this one yet, you should. However, if you haven't, you might do better with the remake. Play that one first, get used to the gameplay in its more refined version, and if you're still curious for the origins of the franchise, then hop into this one without thinking it twice. You won't regret it. If you enjoyed yourself, please press the like button and share the video because I could use all of that help, trust me. Also, if you're a fan of Resident Evil, zombies or horror games in general, you might enjoy subscribing because I'll be covering the other RE games in the nearby future, along with a few other games like the ones on screen right now. As always, stay safe, and if you haven't already, you might enjoy watching my review of the remake to this same game, which should be appearing on screen right now. Have a great time, and I'll see you in the next one.